Good afternoon and welcome to Regulation in the Times of Pandemic and Lessons for the Future, African Responses, and focus on East Africa today. My name is Dan Sjöblom. I will moderate this session. When I'm not moderating IIC sessions, I am the Director General for the Swedish telecoms regulator, PTS. Last year, in 2020, I had the privilege to chair BEREC, which is the regional European organization for telecom regulators. And I, in that capacity, also chaired the ITU GSR 2020 program, where, of course, the pandemic was high on our common agenda. So PTS, the organization I'm in charge of, is not a stranger to Africa. We have a good relationship with many African regulators and regulatory organizations. We're very happy and proud about this. We work together with SPIDER, an organization which is part of the Stockholm University, in a capacity building program for regulators in sub-Saharan Africa. We've done this for a long time, and the purpose of the program is to support regulators in realizing their own strategic projects, but also to strengthen the regulatory cooperation, which is very important. The East African regulators were the first participants to the program, which since then has also spread to other regions. Today is the final part of a three-part series of webinars looking at the responses of regulators and of the industry across Africa to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the webinar that we are about to start will concentrate on Eastern Africa and examine national strategies adopted to guarantee continuity of the essential services of connection to protect ultimately lives, but to keep in general society going and minimize the negative effects of close downs and measures that have a big impact on the economy. And how might the actions of regulators and policymakers inform and facilitate the future modernization of current regulatory frameworks? Will industry objectives and obligations continue? What will be the new normal if we look forward from a regulatory policy and a commercial perspective? There are many things that we are taking with us from this horrible pandemic, of course. And we will look at many issues today, I think, like spectrum availability, digital infrastructure, health, education, services, cybersecurity, and combating disinformation regarding vaccinations or whatever it might be. And we have a good panel of experts with us today to help us with the discussion, highlighting the unique challenges across the continent and the responses that we have seen so far. So we have with us today 5 experts. Hopefully the connections will stay strong, and I will pass the floor on in order to them. We will start with Mrs. Annette Semuwemba, who is the Deputy Executive Director, Enhanced Integrated Framework for EIF. Then we have Mr. Brahim Girbi, who is the Head of Government and Policy Affairs in Middle East and Africa for Nokia. Then we have Irene Kagawa Sewankambo, who is the Acting Executive Director, Engineering and Communication Infrastructure from the Uganda Communications Commission. We have also Kui Kinanyui, I hope that pronunciation was not too bad, who is the Head of Regulatory and Public Policy for Safaricom. And hopefully we also have with us Mr. Ali Simba, who is the Executive Secretary of the East African Communications Organization, EACO. So the webinar itself is planned for a maximum of 90 minutes, and I will call on each speaker to initially address the issue of initiatives taken during the pandemic and what changes in policies and regulations have been pursued as a result of COVID-19. Then we have a second round of comments, and I will ask all speakers to keep their responses to 5 minutes. That can move on and have a little bit more of a conversational atmosphere here. I will try to follow up with questions when there are issues. There will also be possibilities for the audience to submit questions, and I will encourage, of course, also speakers when there are questions to other speakers to come forward. So we have a lively discussion. That I think is the what we really look forward to today. So with those words, I will hand over the floor to Annette, who will be our first speaker on the issue of what have we seen as a response to the COVID pandemic in your area of responsibility. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me. I need to start my timer. I tend to ramble on sometimes. Thank you very much. Initiatives that we took. I will speak about the work of the Enhanced Integrated Framework. We are based at the World Trade Organization. We build capacity of least developed countries, helping them to strengthen their institutional capacity, supporting their productive capacity initiatives so that they can access new markets, they can sustain the markets that they have. And as you might imagine, the pandemic had disastrous effects for these countries. Already they are in a weak place. Institutions are not as strong by virtue of their presence in countries where communication, connectivity is quite difficult and complicated. It was a huge shock when the pandemic manifested in the countries. And as the EIF, our first concern was the health and safety of the people that we work with in the countries. And so we ensured that they had the right tools, that they had the right systems in place. And this required that we had to check what kind of tools they had, what kind of platforms for connectivity. As we know, in many of the countries, it required that people had to stay home. There were lockdowns enforced, and movement and communication among different team members for implementation of projects was very complicated. It was important that this doesn't stop completely because, as you know, once a country has accessed a market, if that market drops, then it's very, very difficult to recover. So we wanted to see how best we could support that continuity. And for us, one way was digital tools. One way was to ensure that they had connectivity. And so what did we do? In some of the countries, we have about 47 countries where we're active. It was a much simpler solutions, like making sure they had an internet connection. So ensuring that we allowed for adjustments to budgets to allow them get the necessary internet infrastructure. In some countries, it was more complicated solutions, like bringing together stakeholders to discuss e-commerce strategies. For example, in Zambia, they've now just launched their e-commerce study, and that is going to lead to an e-commerce strategy that they didn't previously have. I'm based in Uganda right now, but I work in Geneva. And here in Uganda, we had just supported their e-trade readiness assessment. So we supported them reviewing and understanding what are the key challenges that came through from the e-trade readiness assessments, and how can this be turned into concrete actions so that there's a digital wave that starts to support trade and continuity of trade. Of course, we also had to look at new opportunities arising from that situation. And how do we support regional value chains? How do we support trade and investment promotion initiatives? All of these we observed that could still be possible with the right internet and digital policies in place. And I'm sure Irene might be able to speak about this. Other interventions that we took was scaling up our partnerships with international and regional partners, for example, with the World Investment Promotion Agencies, realizing that these partners will be very important in terms of their reach, in terms of their policy formulation processes, and bringing together different partners to discuss lessons learned. Some countries took different approaches, and just hearing and learning from each other, we thought that would also be important, mainly in terms of how they've taken advantage of the digital and international trade processes and policies in place. I must say it hasn't been a walk in the park. It was a bit difficult in some countries, given the impact and its gravity depending on country situations. But nevertheless, we've seen some good outcomes. We've seen countries start new sectors where they initially didn't have any investment, especially in production of PPEs, and so policies around that. We've seen countries tackling time and cost problems involved with trading across borders, the use of monetary incentives and fiscal levers to counter declining foreign and domestic investment. So different solutions there. I think I've used my 5 minutes from my clock, but I could go on and on, or I could come back later. I think I need to give the floor back to you, Dan, so that the next speakers can share their views. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting, and I'm sure we will come back to you for further comments in due course. So next on my list of speakers is Brahim. So you have the floor for the next few minutes. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. And I'm very happy to be speaking in this panel with such distinguished speakers. So from my perspective, I represent Nokia, and basically Nokia is a global company of telecom solutions, working across the globe, but more specifically in Africa, where we have a stronghold and strong foothold, and we have a variety networks, whether it's mobile and fixed networks, and ranging from extensive optical solutions, IP, cloud, and of course, some of you might know, Nokia is also implementing at least most of the, if not most, I mean, a large number of the submarine cables that are connecting the continent. And I think that's important and crucial for the connectivity of the continent to the rest of the world. So, as far as what we have witnessed, looking back at 2020, of course, we were all impacted. And if I speak of what we have seen and what we have experienced, of course, we believe that the critical networks that we build are really important, and really all the networks are critical world infrastructure. So, and I think what happened with the pandemic, it only put to the forefront that criticality of these networks, because of course we realize that we really need good quality and performance networks to be able to connect to do remote work and so on. So luckily for us, at least, the trend in the past few years, pre-COVID, was that the networks have evolved, because it's already expected that the network should be critical, should be resilient, great performance, giving high availability, and so on. So that was an expectation anyways. I think what was unexpected is, of course, the peak and surge of traffic in very short time, but would normally see as a normal growth pattern throughout a year. It happened extremely very quickly. So obviously we had to work very closely with our partners and customers to make sure, because we had a duty to keep the vital communication networks running, even as usage reaches basically unprecedented levels. So what did you do? Of course, the first level principle was we had to, of course, abide to the government guidelines in every country where we operate. While there's this shutdown and so on. So of course, countries have managed differently. Maybe some took more stronger approach initially than others. So of course we had to adapt, and luckily, because the networks have evolved, they have become more automated. A lot of autonomous configurations, and a lot of work can be done remotely. So that really did help a lot. So of course we needed to have interventions when field engineers have to be on the ground. So that of course we needed to get exemptions from the right authorities. But overall, I think it went, I would say, pretty well. So what we do, of course, we focus on abiding and being compliant to government rules and regulations, but also making sure the employees and our customers stay well and safe as when we sort of do these interventions. But of course, we had to be agile enough to support our customers through their upgrade of networks. As we know, many governments and regulators have, allocated a spectrum on a temporary basis, at least to take into account this demand in traffic. And for that, of course, there were different situations, right? There's no rule of thumb here. I think if the spectrum was, let's say, a legacy spectrum or a band that is used, it was merely just a software capability sort of upgrade. So it doesn't have to be sort of a really physical intervention. But if in some instances where we've seen spectrum is actually because maybe there's no available spectrum in the existing bands, then some new band that was not used before. In that particular case, of course, there was some need sometimes for some additional hardware. And in that case, of course, physical integration was required, and this is what happened. So I think what was witnessed is really a fantastic sort of collaboration across the value chain, from supply to the telcos, to actually customs clearance, to governments, to regulators support. Everyone actually played a vital role. And there's actually probably lessons learned for the future that we can really sort of fast track some of these slow processes and make things happen despite these challenging times. So I would say we've seen, of course, this demand merely on the mobile and spectrum, but also we've seen also an increased demand into fixed wireless access, into adjusting and upgrading customer premise equipment, CPEs and some networks, so that's sort of to adapt to better bandwidth and capacity. And we've done a lot of network optimization because the traffic, we had to sort of load the traffic balance, which has changed, right? We had spots where typically those were the spots where we see a lot of traffic, but that traffic has shifted. It almost became like almost no traffic there, but everything has shifted to homes and so on. And that required a lot of network optimization to load that balanced traffic. And a lot of this actually happens remotely, luckily, and also with some physical intervention when needed. But I would say overall, I think it was a lot of collaboration that made it happen, and a lot of lessons learned in terms of maybe for the future. So, and I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for that view from a vendor and a supplier. We will move on, and next on my list is Irene. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what side of the continent you are. So I'm then really enjoying this panel because it's not very often you have such a selection of different parties from across the sector. And listening to them, I was thinking, indeed, as Brahim said, this brought us together in terms of cooperation. Now, as Uganda Communications Commission, of course, we are a regulator of the communication sector, which includes the postal, telecom, and broadcasting. We also have the responsibility of administering and managing the Universal Service and Access Fund, which seeks to extend services to the underserved and unserved areas of the country. Now, as Brahim mentioned, when COVID hit, I remember it was for us 31st March when the president announced we're going into lockdown. And now this was a situation of everybody who typically accesses internet at office needing to be home and now being told work from home. For many people, this was even alien. And of course, we all had all these peculiar situations of then, okay, how do you get computers and terminals to people to be able to connect home? How do you have the solutions, people having connectivity? As Brahim said, when they're at home, normally it's just a few hours online and, just using their phones for social media. Now it was work. So they needed greater connectivity. We had children staying home, parents being told children are going online for classes. You have one phone in a house and possibly multiple children. How do you divide all that? So those were kind of some of the challenges we had to deal with as a country. So what did we do? One of those we looked at was, okay, when look at the different stakeholders, where is the challenge? Where are the gaps that we need to address? Critically, of course, was connectivity, which the operators jumped very fast in terms of making sure that the relevant connectivity was provided. Of course, at first, we were all in a panic of, do they have enough spectrum? And no offense to the operators on this call, I would say a de facto answer is always, no, we do not have enough spectrum. They always want some more. I guess it's an audio. And as Jim said, then came the equipment. And for many of them, we all had the panic of now when the flights are not moving, how will they get the equipment in on time, get the site permission? You have all these authorizations that have to be obtained. Fortunately for us, a lot of it was already in the process of movement. So we did not have such a difficulty in terms of addressing the gap in terms of connectivity. However, as the commission, we noted that now we were having long queues of trucks along the borders because of now all the health checks that had been introduced. And we thought this was an opportunity to demonstrate how ICTs can actually help. Because one would save the community around the borders by ensuring those truck drivers do not delay at the borders and also, end up transmitting the disease to each other and carry it into the country. So we put Wi-Fi hotspots at the various different border points. We started with 5 and added 4. And the purpose of this was to facilitate the truck drivers to reduce how much time they needed to spend at the borders if they can do some of the filings electronically, so that, again, you have a quicker run through at the borders. We also noted, of course, we did not survive the whole conspiracy theory about 5G and, causing coronavirus. And so we also then had to take on the responsibility of sensitizing the public, putting out a lot more information and demystifying all these conspiracies out there, so that people had, again, confidence. And of course, we did not want it to escalate to banning of masks. We had to actually bring it down to the local context and, point out if you have a case in an area which has never even heard of 5G, how do you then blame 5G for that coronavirus? So we had to go down, explain to them, the phone, the airwaves, and then also give them information. For many people, we had a situation of the farmers who are now stuck with so much produce because they could not move. And then the customers who are at home and needed the produce but could not go to the market. So we needed to find a way to create a linkage. And as Annette said, that was one of the areas where, we have this popular borders. We call them border, the bikes. So you have the bikes doing the courier delivery services. And then the farmers, they got them an application so that they could also put out their produce and reduce the loss that was going to happen with all these people stuck with rotting, while at the receiver side, now the prices were shooting up because of being able to access. So again, ICTs came in to reduce that. Now, as a country, of course, not every child comes from a home that's fortunate to have internet, to be able to go online. So we still had these areas. Now, as Uganda Communications Commission, we've been having this program where we had put computers in schools, and we're very happy with our project. We had school labs in almost every government secondary school, and we're even providing them connectivity. But now, guess what? The schools were closed. So those labs could no longer be relevant to the children who needed to continue studying, but were now at home. So as meant, it was decided we utilize every available opportunity there was. For example, there was radio and television. So you had children sitting around on radios and TVs, attending classes. And then we still had to go through the rudimentary method of taking printouts, one per family, in the local councils. Now, of course, that we keep saying as UCC, every situation is an opportunity. So that helped us reevaluate where do we need to have intervention, we need to change our regulatory approaches so that we are more facilitatory of the whole digital transformation that we all speak about, of saying, do you want to bring everybody on board? What is it that needs to be done vis-a-vis what is typically maybe the this has largely informed how we have changed in terms of looking at our regulatory approaches. We want to make sure all our spectrum assignments, we give contiguous spectrum so that the operators have more spectrum to utilize and are able to utilize the spectrum they have. Technology neutrality is also another issue. We are now making all our bands committed such that operators are able to refarm and also use the different technologies available depending on the situation. And of course, also on the universal service side, looking at digital skilling and not just computers. Let's face it, for many people, the closest they'll get to a computer is a phone, and it is still a computer. So we needed to also adjust the digital skilling and learn how to use digital technology to address the very digital skilling we're talking about, so that we bring more people online, teaching them how it is relevant to them. SMEs were a key target for us, farmers, helping them appreciate how ICTs can help them continue, even when they're in situations like this. I could go on, but I think I'll stop there for now, Dan.
Thank you very much, Irene. Very interesting number of issues that you had to face, and quite some concrete measures that you took to respond to them. So we'll get back to that in a minute, I think. Next on my list of speakers is now Kui. Please give us your opening introduction.
Thank you, Dan, and good afternoon, evening, and morning to our fellow panelists as well as our audience. It's my pleasure to be here today. So I work with Safaricom, which is one of the larger mobile companies in Kenya, and I'll just share some quick highlights of what we did to approach the pandemic, as well as what were some of the regulatory interventions we saw come across at a country level. So very early on in the pandemic, we realized that we had to create a plan of action to tackle the issues that we were facing. With over 30 million customers, we practically touch all the lives of every Kenyan. We power probably what is arguably the largest and most advanced mobile money system in the world. So we knew we had to come up with a concrete plan to figure out how we were going to approach the pandemic. We broke it down into what we call our 6-point plan, which covered everything from how to enrich the customer experience, how to make sure our staff and partners were protected as they did their work. Obviously, as the lockdown occurred, we had instances where our staff and partners were not able to move, so we're not able to service the network. We had to also create robust systems around our mobile money system to make sure it was up and running. We also had to facilitate the country's need to work from home and have education from home. So in a nutshell, we did everything that we could to try and meet those needs. We introduced interesting services like doubling capacity for our enterprise and home customers on fiber, as well as providing free educational content to our customers, and I'll talk a bit about that in a bit. But throughout all this, I think it's very key to note that we didn't do this alone. We worked very close with our partners, the regulators, the government, the various ministries across the industry as well, just to ensure that we're able to develop these systems and put in place the relevant services. So from a regulatory perspective, there are 3 key interventions that I want to mention that shaped the country's response to the pandemic. And I think we've heard from Irene and Brian on some of the similarities that you might hear about just now. So first was the quick and incredibly helpful designation of mobile service operators as an essential service provider. And this goes back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of having the freedom to move even despite or in spite of a lockdown in the country. So this designation actually allowed us to continue to undertake our duties. It allowed the country to remain connected, even as we started to look at more consumer-driven interventions that we could do to help the country overcome the initial shocks of the lockdown and restrictions in movement. As you're probably aware, Kenya was pretty quick when it came to responding to the pandemic. We put in place some measures to ensure that we learned the lessons from what was happening across the world and put them in place fairly quickly. So lockdowns came to us fairly early in around March. So as mentioned, I mean, we have 30 million customers, obviously connected by a grid of lots of sites across the network, each requiring lots of monitoring for uptime. And of course, the regulator was monitoring us quite closely to see if we were providing quality of service alongside uptime. So the designation as an essential service allowed us to be able to retain and in some cases actually exceed our service delivery for our customers. Some interesting stats we saw during the early part of the pandemic was that we saw an increase of up to 70% in usage in mobile data, as well as 35% in fiber data demand. And that was just due to people working from home and also the schools also rolling out online programs. The second regulatory intervention that I'd like to speak about is a decision that was taken by the Kenyan Ministry of Information and the industry regulator, who is the communications authority, to provide special interventions to help us manage the increased demand for capacity. So key among that was the approval of temporary spectrum allocations for operators, which allowed us to provide enhanced voice and data capacity for our customers. This, of course, enabled the transition towards the work from home culture, the schooling from home, and allowed life to basically start to continue. Allowed us to meet the capacity that was really increasing. And as we saw in our markets from the USA to Uganda, this is something that several regulators rolled out during the period just to help operators be able to meet the demand. The last intervention that I'd like to call out is perhaps a little unique to Kenya and Safaricom, but again, it was mirrored in other markets that have similar products. What we noticed is that as businesses went cashless and as the vulnerable people in societies had to reduce their access to cash due to stay-at-home orders, we had to kind of think about how we could use our mobile money platform to meet those needs. At the same time, the government put in place a directive that it wanted to reduce the use of cash in order to contain the spread of the virus, and this led to the reduction of transaction fees for amounts below 1,000 shillings, which is just under $10. And while this may seem a small gesture, it actually translated to much needed relief for our customers, enabling them to pay for goods and services, to transact without having to actually leave the home or to even handle cash, and just basically do more with their phones, which was key for us. So in summary, I think these three interventions were taken quite early in the pandemic. But for me, they speak to the fact that we were able to make some pretty quick, pretty agile decisions that were able to help us kind of get over the first hump of what we were going to do beyond the first shock of what was happening to the world at that particular space. I think the question that really arises for me is, how do we make these measures more sustainable? How do we keep them going into the future? I know we're going to be talking about that in a bit, Dan, so I'll hand back to you on that.
Thank you very much, Kui. Indeed, we are going to be looking into the future in just a moment. We have one final speaker with us on this opening round, and that's Ali. I'll hand over to you for your first intervention as well.
Thank you, Danny. I hope you can hear me. I was not around during the testing. Thank you. I was supposed to have this meeting in the office, and when we were just about to go to bed yesterday, the government announced a new lockdown, and I left many of my staff in the office. So I came home expecting that I should be able to manage to do it at home. And around in the mid-noon, the electricity went out. So I know you guys were trying to look for me. It just came up. And as I'm speaking now, there's no electricity in Kigali. So I'm using a hotspot for my mobile phone to participate in this meeting. Now I'm one of those who are very lucky to have all of those options. But if you look to what COVID has come and to tell us what is happening, you find out a lot of people do not have those options. So I want to highlight this as one of the key issues that, as we discuss this, is something that we need to discuss much more. As you have introduced me, I work for East African Communication Organization. It's a regional organization that deals with the regulator, operators, and academia in East Africa. We are very lucky that today I have two of my members, that is Irene, my sister, from UCC, and Kui, who is from Safaricom. They're one of the members, and they've touched most of the issues that happened in East Africa. But I'll just like to point out a few number of issues. In general, as the countries, what we went through as East African countries. As you know, when the COVID hit, there was no option to organize or to have a common stand on how to move forward. So every country decided to do what it could do. Now we as a regional body whose our job is to coordinate issues, we quickly called a meeting for our members to discuss, and especially our interest was to see what is happening in these countries from the regulatory perspective of view, and what the best practices others within the region can learn from each other. So we had a meeting quickly during the lockdown for the both sector, I mean for the ICT and telecom, but also for the postal services. And we noted a number of issues that have been raised. I think number one, for the most of the countries, I think it was agreed that connectivity was considered the essential service. So the workers in these 6 countries were allowed to go out to do their job to make sure that people are connected. That was one of the very things that we learned. But another thing, this was also mentioned by Kui, is about the mobile financial services. In most of our countries here, they decided to remove taxes and costs so that to help people to be able to use mobile money services, they were discouraging the use of cash. We also find out some free Wi-Fi hotspots that were provided by the government. And of course, some of these measures have now been removed because I think we were thinking we are moving towards a stable situation, which I don't think we are right now. But as my other colleague have pointed out, I think something that we learned from this is on numbers. I know we like to talk about statistics. You say, you know, we have mobile phone penetration of this, but it's when the COVID came, we realized these are just numbers. Because really, if I take even myself as an example, I have 2 kids. I used to have 1 computer at home, and I thought I'm covered. Then they say there's this online schooling, and this kid are in different class. Now, how do you do it? Now in Africa, having 5 to 6 kids is something normal. Now I'm trying to imagine a house with 6 kids that's supposed to be online. So really, I think the things that we used to take for granted have been blown out, and now we are aware that we are not where we are supposed to be. And another thing that was very good to me, I think, that I've noted from our regulators, there's no specific solution for this, but our regulators, and most of them are converged in this region, they were very quick and agile to move according to the situation. And I believe we cannot have a specific solution for COVID only because it's part of our emergency issues. There could be drought, there could be fraud and things like that. So I think the way they reacted, they showed that our regulators are very agile. They're able to move according to the situation, and probably going to the future, they should be more into that situation as we don't know what kind of emergency will come in the future. I'll end here for the beginning, Dan, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ali. That's the end of the first round of comments from all of you, and I think it's been a very good round. So there obviously have been very many different things, but many of you have, in addition to giving good examples of activities and challenges that have occurred, I think a common theme is that many of you have talked about the way that we very quickly moved into some new level of digitalization and having greater needs for not only social but really normal life kind of activities for ourselves, for our family, and for our societies, and how we have met this. But I think it has jumped us maybe several years into the future for those who have the fortune of being connected or being able to connect, as you were saying, and who have the terminals, the computers, like many of you have talked about, is of course a continuing challenge. So I think it would be interesting to keep that thought in mind, and to think a little bit about, I think, the bigger picture moving beyond the pandemic, which is of course a very big picture as it is. But as always, we have the burning issue of the digital divide, which I think has never been more burning than during these circumstances, when if you are locked down and you are not connected, then you are really in a much worse position than those who have the fortune of being connected. So I would like, in a second round, all the speakers to touch on these positive experiences from working digitally, connecting digitally, collaborating digitally, and how that may be thought to affect measures that are going to come in this year, and maybe in the next year as well, but in the relatively short frame, to combat or to ensure that we connect everyone to the digital era and to the possibilities that we have. Because indeed, I think as you finished, Ali, who knows how long we will be doing this, and who knows which challenges are waiting for us around the corner. So connecting everyone is, I think, more important than ever. And I think, if anything, we should have, as policymakers, as companies, and as regional organizations, we really should have the ear of the decision makers at this time. It's never been clearer and easier to make the argument. So what do you expect to happen, and which actors would you think should step up activities to close our digital divide in the coming 1 to 2 years? And I'll start in the same order as we did last time. So I will go back to you, Annette. Maybe you want to start the second round as well.
Thank you very much, Dan. And I think it was a really interesting first round of discussions. I have learned certainly a lot about what happened elsewhere. And I think there's a lot more that we don't know. There's a lot more that we don't know, because the situation continues to change. And the EIF has a unique position, because we support countries to undertake analytical work. Some of you might be familiar with the diagnostic trade integration studies that we support in the least developed countries. And these help them understand what are the constraints to trade. Now, we had never undertaken those studies taking the angle that focuses on if there's a crisis situation, if there's a pandemic, what do you do? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the constraints? And what would be the solutions? So what we're doing now is to encourage the countries to come to us, so that together we can do a bit more analytical work. And I do see colleagues here that would be very useful during those processes to try and understand and come up with key solutions, which we then market with the different development partners. We know that we rely a lot on our development partners to support our projects that then tackle these constraints. So we'll be now looking more at the digital angle. We'll be looking more at how we incorporate this within the DTISs, but also looking at the leaving no one behind, making sure that we're focused on more vulnerable groups. For example, the women, in the pandemic, maybe something that we didn't hear is, while the men or trading centers to just to gossip a bit and just have a social chat, the women stayed home to look after the children, to make sure the homes continued to function, to make sure there was food. We had free distribution of food packages by government to receive these. And so they weren't able to continue their businesses. They had to leave whatever they did before, just to ensure that the family stayed together during the pandemic. So could our studies take a broader look or a more a narrow and focused look at some of these vulnerable sectors so that we can understand what solutions we can undertake. I talked to Alice, have had a chance to review these e-trade readiness assessments. I know that one has been commissioned in Uganda, as I mentioned earlier, but in some countries like Burundi, countries in East Africa, these studies haven't been undertaken. In South Sudan. So I would be looking to ensuring that we bring these on so that they can understand the main policy constraints. These studies look at about 7 policy areas: payment solutions, connectivity, everything that you've talked about, and they try and put together an action plan to how these issues can be addressed. So perhaps looking forward, I think bringing these other countries into the front, and then looking at a regional e-trade readiness study or assessment or commerce strategy. I know in some regions, like in West Africa, they do have this commissioned and ongoing. In East Africa, I think there'll be value in a study of that nature, maybe led by Ali and his team, since they do take that regional role. Another point is on, we've had new sectors coming up that we hitherto didn't imagine would be beneficial or would could be tapped into by our country. So how do we continue to broaden the sectors? We know that the agriculture sector was affected massively in terms of exports. It was impossible to get goods across the border. The flights were very few and in between, and there was a scramble to try and get as much as could be taken out. But we now must start to look at other sectors of potential. Tourism was grossly affected. So looking into services, looking into the medicinal, medical sectors where we can look into medical technologies, encouraging the youth, very, very innovative. We have a very youthful and innovative population. So how they can support us with the innovations that are technology-based, mobile payment platforms that bring together people to be able to trade. And a few, I think, exist in the region, but if we can increase those numbers, and as the EIF would be more than happy to continue to support that work. Our main partners in the countries are the Ministry of Trade. So we work closely with the Ministries of Trade, but I think we need to encourage them to reach out to the broader stakeholdership, other partners that have a role to play, so that we have one conversation that's ongoing, that brings everybody together, that allows us to have solutions that we all own and are all ready to implement. So maybe with those few points, I will hand back, Dan, to you.
Thank you, Annette. I have a follow-up question for you that I will ask you, but maybe other panelists might think of that as well. And it just strikes me listening to all the activities that you mentioned. I think they all sound fantastic, but it just strikes me as a slight worry is, are we able to keep up with so many different strands of activity, or do we need sort of like a master plan and maybe some coordination of all activities, or is it more beneficial to have all these activities growing, or is there a risk that we spend too much time getting projects started to be too many different actors and lose sort of the main thrust of a bigger sort of centrally governed or planned program? Do you have any views on this?
Yes, I do have views, and I think it's a really important question, and we don't have anything to show for that time that we have spent. And that's why I talked about the coordination role of the Ministry of Trade, for instance. In our case, that the plan could be drawn out. And I think there's a lot that's ongoing already upon which we can build. As I mentioned, for example, the DTISs that we are undertaking and the extent to which it is now focused on this particular important issue is really, really important. So making sure that within the frameworks that exist, these are very important developments relating to the pandemic and its impact and solutions that we could undertake. I also mentioned Ali, for instance, as an organizer, the regulators, I think they have a role to play if they took together these ideas and developed a plan that everybody owns. So yeah, I think coordination is definitely key.
Thank you, Annette. And with that, I will pass the floor on to Brahim for his views on how we move forward into digital gap closing measures once we are beyond the pandemic, or even if we're not.
Yes.
Back to you.
Yes. Yes. So thank you. So I think obviously the gap and the connectivity gap, we know about it, right? And we know that there are some, unfortunately, inequalities as far as these gaps. But what came quite strong during this pandemic is that it put to the front that, I mean, the connectivity gap is not only a last mile issue. It's not just because some areas do not have base stations that those are underserved or unserved, but the rest actually have access and it works fine. I think it's also a question of having a full end-to-end good quality network. In other words, you could put the best base station, but see, if you don't have good backhauling, if you don't have the right transmission network, the backbone, the international connectivity, the cross-border connectivity when it's traffic across borders, all this actually plays a role in the quality of the service, the broadband service that you will have at the end. So it's not a last mile issue, but that we have to look at it holistically from an end-to-end perspective. And two, it's not only a rural question. Also, you know, people sometimes when they think about gap, they think systematically of rural areas underserved. But in fact, we've seen that even in urban centers, in cities, even in developed countries, by the way, some people found themselves isolated socially, educationally, economically, because they lacked or had poor broadband services or not at the level that is needed. And in some instances, it was mentioned that sometimes you only have one PC or one phone, and how do you manage when you have many kids? So really, I think it was more of a wake-up call that it's really a question not only about rural, it's not a last mile. And if you think particularly about Africa, the population is supposed, at least if we trust the reports, that by 2050, the population will triple, at least in the cities, because of migration flows and so on. But that means we have to think now into making the cities sustainable, smart, and of course, taking care also of this connectivity gap, not only about where this underserved service, but also making sure it's good quality connectivity. Now, what needs to be done? Obviously, from government perspective, I think most governments, and we've seen really very impressive actions and action plans put in place by the regulators and policymakers everywhere globally, but also specifically in Africa and East Africa. So obviously, and I think we can never say it enough, I think we need more spectrum. And I think that is no surprise, because that is more like the engine really of making sure to deliver and to absorb all the traffic and the traffic demand, which is increasing. And when I say spectrum, of course, on all the different, whether it's, you know, the low bands, but also mid bands and high bands. And as we transition and move, of course, to adopt 4G and 5G, of course, it would be very critical to have access to the spectrum of all these different bands. And I think also the spectrum neutrality question is important, I think, I'm sure, because as you try to reform, adopt new technologies, it's always good to leverage on the assets that you have as far as spectrum to implement, sort of adopt new technology. So that's, I mean, the obvious. But I think we've seen that the necessity to really to facilitate a lot of the regulatory sort of hurdles when it comes to permitting. For example, if you need to react and implement and put sites, or sometimes configurations indoor, outdoor, small sites, sometimes even these sites, small cells, they have to be put really quickly on light poles or bus stations and things like that. These really would require sometimes cumbersome processes of approvals, not only from regulators, but sometimes from municipalities and cities and so on. So these things I think we need to rethink and make sure that this would be expedited so we can really move fast if we need to sort of, you know, accommodate sort of this shift in traffic demand and so on. So this is really important. So the permitting, the regulatory reform, I think also allow infrastructure sharing when needed and when required, you know, because it allows to avoid duplication of efforts and digging and trenching. And it's also good for policymakers to think of bundling, let's say, projects, telecom with construction, so on and so on, where you're digging or building highways or projects or buildings or new zones, new construction zones. You think of laying out the fiber already or building or connecting the building so that you already have those in place. So it makes it easy afterwards to just more like a plug and play rather than have to dig again and all the cost and the approvals and the permits and the right of ways and so on. So these are, I would say, from some of the actions I think that regulators and policymakers should do in the short term. Of course, learn from the how sort of we reacted and acted and implemented these really fast solutions to be more like a modus operandi, hopefully in the future. And I think what I can say is also, I think the connectivity is a foundation, but it's only half of the equation. I think it was clear that we need also to work on other aspects, whether it's on the digital services and most certainly the digital skills. I can certainly cite one of the examples here where we have worked in Kenya with UNICEF, just to show, I think governments are doing tremendous effort. The government of Kenya has put in place this digital literacy project, right? So it's important, and they have distributed 1 million, tablets, and they intend to connect 40,000 schools. It's really an ambitious plan. So when you have that foundation and that plan, that it means, of course, it's easier than to go and because you have already some foundation to work on. So and then what we've seen, of course, is the connectivity gap, but also the digital content, of course. So we did collaborate with UNICEF, with the government of Kenya, but also the operators to sort of, to connect schools. So the issue was not only about connectivity. I think the connectivity is the easiest part, because in fact, you can have technical solutions, you could connect. So we luckily found support and partnership with the operators as well, because the operators helped us. And I think here I have Kui, and I think Safaricom did also support this project. And we are very glad to work with all the operators, because very noble cause and very important project here. Not only to connect schools, but as I said, the technology is the simple part. I think we had to also deal with the content itself, the digital content, because it has to be compliant with the curriculum of the government. So the government and authorities and education have to sort of be extremely involved here. But also, we cannot do it alone. So the operators were there, the government, but also UNICEF, of course, because they really have that power to sort of look and identify all these schools and work on the development of the digital content. So this is just an example that we started, and it's very important. And on top of that, the teachers had to be trained, because they are sort of giving new tools to sort of use and to migrate into this digital sort of way of teaching and so on. And there's also focus on children and students with disabilities. So you have to also make sure that the content is also adapted. So there's a lot of work really. It has nothing to do with technology, but it's really more focused on really making sure the right skills, the right content is there. As that's an example, and it takes a long time, because we started and we connected 10 schools to make the proof of the context, but the idea, of course, is to scale it and to move forward. And luckily, I think we have also the support of the operators and the government, so hopefully we'll make it happen. But that's a very good example that really we need to work on different fronts, not only on the connectivity, but at so many different levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Brahim. A question for you would be, I mean, as a supplier, you obviously have the benefit of seeing quite a lot of different markets, whereas others may be more limited in their regional sort of day-to-day activities. So a question for you would be, do you think there are enough good platforms, generally speaking, or in the region that we are addressing today, more particularly for sharing best practices in those sort of related areas of policy that you mentioned, like zoning and permits, and what really affects somehow the ability to work on connectivity issues as such? Or could more be done? And so, if so, who should take up that task?
Yeah, I think this is, as I said, it's really a multi-stakeholder approach here. And obviously, the issue is not specific to East Africa. And I'm saying even these discussions about right-of-ways and implementing small cells, I mean, we're having them even in developed countries, because sometimes you have to deal with the municipality and not the regulatory authority. And the more we move into adopting ICT in different sectors, and we see it now with 5G. 5G start first phase, of course, mobile broadband, but 5G will go also to the verticals, to the industries. And as part of that, I think the frontiers for regulators is becoming blurry, because they have different regulators for different sectors. And how do you get this across, and how do you collaborate? So I think we need to have this crosstalk between the different regulators, different authorities. To some extent, maybe we need to think of one single body in a government or a country to be able to sort of overlook these different sort of sectors and verticals, to make sure, at least at the ICT level, it's a coherent strategy. And then I think you need to look at harmonized efforts at the regional level. And I'm glad to have here, of course, representatives, not only from countries, but a list of countries. And I think you have international platforms. I think they have so many activities happening, and I believe ATU, which was supposed to be here today, but also ITU, and we have many countries, the regulators and platforms that share best practices. So definitely, I think there's also, and we, of course, we're happy to share, you know, even after this call with some of the stakeholders if interested to, at least what we see and what we've seen implemented and what we've been doing on our side as well.
Thank you. Yes, I think the sharing of good practices or best practices is becoming more vital as there are more and more bodies, regulators, stakeholders involved in these processes, both nationally, regionally, and globally. And the complexity is certainly not diminishing. I think we all experience that in our daily lives, but also the possibilities are then increasing. So let's find the positive approach to it. So with that, thank you, Brahim, and we move on to Irene for the issue of closing the digital gap.
Thank you, Dan. I keep telling people I have to say it off the record. I'm one of those, I think, who has something to thank COVID for. Because before COVID was there, we were having to sing the opportunities, the importance of ICTs. When COVID came, we no longer had to sing so much. People all across government now had an appreciation of why ICTs are important and why they should be prioritized. As a country, we are proud that we have developed the Digital Uganda vision that gives not only just government whole approach, but it looks at how all of us can bring the different actors, private sector, public sector, can make sure we realize that digital roadmap. And you were asking Dan about, you know, who should do it. And that has also been a challenge for us because when you have one sector seeming like they are telling the other sector what to do, there is always that friction. So the Digital Uganda vision seeks to draw that roadmap for us as a country in terms of what is it that we want to achieve in terms of the digital side, and also within the different sectors. Annette spoke to this, like tourism and all these other sectors. What are those must-dos or low-hanging fruits or priorities in each of those that we need to do? If we're to bring the ICTs, as you've said, we ended up leapfrogging into what all of us have been talking about. Now we are there, so we now have to walk the talk and demonstrate. And you were talking about, you know, how do we ensure it's, you know, we don't leave anyone behind. And as pointed out, yes, it's not just coverage, but coverage is key. As a country, we've said we want to reach all corners because every part of our country has people in it. But the different parts of the country, because of the different landscape, different vegetation. I know I visited Sweden when I went for the Spider program. So I know it's not unique to Uganda that we have all these unique areas that we want to cover. And that made us appreciate the importance of being open to use of different technologies. Brahima also talked about infrastructure. It became even more apparent then. During the COVID, we completed the release of the national roaming. Along our borders, we've been having a challenge across the countries of network spillover that was causing forced roaming. And now we are looking at that roaming instead as an opportunity to say within the country, how do we leverage? I even have operators who are not looking at roaming where they do not have coverage, but looking instead at what I prefer to call more infrastructure sharing than just roaming. Even within the city centers, Brahima was talking about that in terms of available capacity. So they want to leverage capacity of another network to be able to provide a better service to their customers. We're also looking at the issue of co-deployment. We've talked about it before, it was a cliche, but now importantly, it's become apparent. How do we not just mandate, but foster and promote and encourage this within the sector among the operators, but also cross-sector. We have it with energy, which is normally the first one to come on board, using the electricity poles that are used for distribution. So those are now also being used to quickly spring out cables to be able to provide, to realize that fiber to the home and fiber to the premises dream. The other area we also have realized is operational subsidization is something we're also looking into, especially in the rural areas where the revenues may not be sufficient to cover the cost of providing services in those areas. So we're looking at using our universal service fund in a model of, before we have been doing CAPEX subsidization, but now what we're studying is an operational subsidization targeting the tower companies, since most of the operators are now going for an approach of where they don't maintain the towers themselves, but instead use the tower companies. So if we facilitate the tower companies, then hopefully they won't charge the operators so much for hosting them. And in the end, we don't have services being unreasonably expensive to the people in the various areas. I won't speak to the permits because already a number of persons have talked about it in terms of authorization. You have to go to the National Environment Authority, then you have to civil aviation in some areas, then the local governments who look at it as a source of revenue. So we need that mindset for everybody to appreciate why we need to speed it up, have faster turnaround for the permits, and also reduce how many permits that an operator would need to get to be able to set up infrastructure. Utilization of spectrum is another one that we are looking at as a key issue, opening up more new bands, for example, in some of the microwave, looking at the fixed wireless services in there, and also reviewing the existing band policies so that they catch up with the trends in the sector and make them more usable. The other issue we've observed is devices. If I have coverage and I don't have the devices, still I can't get online. And for many of our people, they are poor. So the cost of a smartphone vis-a-vis feeding my family, vis-a-vis, you know, I'm in a grass-thatched house, and would my priority be the phone or a computer? So as a government, we're having to look into how do we facilitate these persons in terms of low-cost devices that are able to do the host of at least the basic services like broadband, you know, they're internet enabled, even if they're maybe not smartphones, but even if we can get smartphones that are cheaper, solar charging ones, then we address more of the population and are able to bring more and more people on board. I know KU, they had a program on subsidized phones sometimes. So this is something we're also looking at, of operators providing subsidized phones that a person then pays off over a longer time through their subscription with the operator, so that we have more people on board. But the reality is not everybody can afford to either acquire or maintain a device. So we still need to critically look at the issue of shared facilities. In Uganda, we have taken the approach of providing broadband services at the various public libraries across the country so that people can go there and access these various services. The other issue that we have observed as an impediment is the cost of services. So during COVID, as Ki pointed out, there was the issue of zero rating of some of the sites. And as she pointed out, these are things we need to think about. Can we keep them, you know, is it sustainable for us? Is it something we should look at? Because I know, for example, we don't have a net neutrality policy in Uganda. So would it be something that government then subsidizes some of these sites that provide, you know, the basic public services so that persons are able to get access to information despite the affordability issues? We have a program with Research and Education Network Uganda that is helping us leverage economies of scale through that and connect up the different institutions. So the program I mentioned earlier, where we are putting ICT labs, we then use Research and Education Network to provide connectivity. And as the Commission, we pay 100% for the first year and then start scaling that so that eventually the schools get it into their budget and are able to pick it up. Of course, this is a challenge in some areas where even parents struggle to pay, to contribute for the child to get a cup of porridge during the day. at school. So now when we talk about connectivity, and this goes back again to your question, Dan, and comment Brahima said, of then having the other parties across government come in, like, you know, he mentioned in Kenya, so Ministry of Education making this as part of their budget so that they facilitate the connectivity costs, operational costs for some of the schools. On skilling, I'm one of those who believes ICTs are not like a bicycle. A bicycle, you put it there and figures it out somehow. For ICTs, there's always that fear of overcoming that initial start and, you know, being able to figure out, you're always scared of spoiling it. So it is still critical for us to provide that digital skilling at all the levels, from the informal to the formal sector. And then we talked about solutions and applications. We have, as has been pointed out, we have such a young community. Annette spoke to this. You know, more than, I think 52% of Uganda's population is below the age of 10 years. So we have an opportunity in terms of innovation and unemployment is very high. So this is an opportunity for them to create solutions and applications that are locally relevant, so that people don't go online saying, but I am not going on Facebook because I don't have who to communicate with. Let it be more than just, you know, social media, something relevant. Education, we have a pilot where we have a teacher being in one school and using their phone to project and provide classes to students across the country in the different participating schools across the country, so that it's no longer about the other is the good school and this is not a good school. There is that sharing of knowledge across. We have also taken the program to farmers, where we say there are all these applications that have been developed for the farmer, but how do you get the farmer to actually utilize, teach them, and work beyond just, you know, the vouchers that have been created for them, the markets, them being able to see how to participate as a cooperative or as individuals and actually harness these ICTs to speak to themselves. Small and medium enterprises are another one where we thought it's a great opportunity. Selling even a broom, it's always amusing to me how the basic broom is put on the internet and it's 100 times or 1,000 times more expensive just because someone has put it on the internet. So helping this to say, okay, how do you use a phone or a small computer to manage even your accounts within the program? How do you order spares for a mechanic online and have them delivered quickly? Annette also spoke about the other interest groups like the women. We have a program for women with disabilities, so that beyond them having disabilities, yes, we've had a challenge in terms of when we did the ICT school labs, getting the specialized computers for persons with disabilities. And it's not just hearing and you know, visual. There are all sorts of disabilities. So how do we make sure there are ICTs for this? And I know I could go on and on, but my comment would be, there's not one act that can do it alone. It can be government, it can't be private sector, it can't be the consumer. It has to be a collaboration, it has to be joint. It's not one sector that's going to, one sector may drive it, but it requires everybody to come on board. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Irene. Indeed, very many interesting things there coming up. So to all participants, I will just remind you that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can lodge questions if you want. I'm also aware that we are approaching 75 minutes, and I promised that we would end at 90 minutes, which means that we are in the last quarter of an hour of this program. So I will actually take the liberty now of taking a question that has come in the Q&A from Russell, who's asking if there is a risk that we overcorrect as a result of COVID and that we might go back to school, to offices and so on, and that there will be other challenges that that we should be focusing on back again. And to this, in our chat here, we had an interesting comment, I think, from Annette that I will also just mention here, where she, I think, very correctly says that there is no likely turning back, that we see home and homeschooling, home working developing at the moment. It might reduce when the pandemic is over, but the new normal will retain the possibilities of more activity from the home and possibly more hybrid kind of situations, which I think all of us have experienced and I think found a little bit challenging. So I think those are aspects that are interesting to take into account when we continue to address how to address the digital gap going forward, because if indeed the new normal contains more digital abilities and choices, the issue of the gap is of course all the more important to address. So I'll continue with our second round there, and I think the floor is now over to Kui.
Thanks, Dan. So just to pick up on that thread on are we overcorrecting? I think it's my belief that COVID has actually shown us, it's exposed the areas of sensitivity that we actually have. It's given us an opportunity to actually think about what we mean when we say the digital divide. What do I mean by that? I think it was Irene who said that most countries in the region already have their digital blueprints. They have an understanding of what they need to do to bridge the digital divide. But if I were to just condense those blueprints into one sentence, it's all about access. It's all about being able to create the avenues of availability so that we're able to overcome these challenges that we've seen during this pandemic. And I think we've been exposed by the pandemic in the fact that we're actually now seeing the areas that we need to focus on quite urgently, whether it's education and ensuring that kids have access to the internet, or whether it's health and ensuring that everybody is able to access, telehealth solutions or anything that may help them access services a bit more efficiently. I think we've seen the areas where we need to work on that. So I think we need to start moving towards our plan Bs. We need to start thinking about how we work with this situation and make it last and make it more meaningful for our various stakeholders. Because I don't think this is going to go away. I think this is an opportunity to actually do more amongst ourselves. So if I was to answer who's responsible for driving this change, I think we know it's government, we know it's the private sector, we know it's regulators, service providers, civil society, who all need to come together and examine these issues. I think what we need to now put emphasis on is action. So how do we act? How do we create the right investments to correct these issues and back them so that they're able to actually increase innovation and then increase access to essential services in the way that we need to. And around that, just create the supportive policies that are required to ensure that we build more sustainable industries. So that would be my response, Dan.
Thank you very much, Kui. And just to close the second round of comments, the floor goes to Ali, please.
Thank you, Danny. Usually when you speak last, you find out that people touch all the things you wanted to say. But I think what I want to mention here is that we used to talk about digital divide, and we looked at it quite different as we are looking at it now. Because as it was spoken by Irene, by Kui, our issue is no longer access in the network, but the operators are doing a very good job. But in issue of devices, I think this is the key. And that's what the COVID has shown us. You can have the internet at home, you have only one PC, and you have 2 kids. You can have good coverage at home, you don't have a laptop for the kids. So I think that is very key. The devices, we should put a lot of emphasis on devices. And number 2, who should lead us? I've been in this sector for quite some time. And one of the issues that we used to see back then in that is one sector telling others what to do. We are talking about e-education. The ICT sector is telling the education sector, you're supposed to have this and this and this. And this is not going to work. It didn't work then, and it's not going to work now. As my colleague pointed, we need somebody to coordinate, but the ideas should come from all parts involved. No single person should seem like is the leader of this. It's multi-sector approach that we need to move on. Another thing that I want to mention in relevance to what we do as a IIACO is the issue of region harmonization. because some of these issues can be solved through harmonization of policies in the regional level. And we take an example of when we came up with a roaming framework where we enabled the people in the region to move free with their phone without worrying about roaming charges. And we are very lucky that now we have 5 countries that are participating in this, leaving out Burundi, which is very near, very soon will come on board. With that, we no longer deal with the issues at the border, because now it becomes an opportunity. In that case, somebody can use, in Uganda, you can use the network in Nairobi from Kenya, but still pay the same amount of money. So we are going to remove that issue of fearing roaming charges for the poor people along the border. But it's bringing again opportunities, because we find out that a network provider in one country for building a network at the border is not paying for him because the few people and things like that. But for the other side, you find out the business case makes sense. So when we don't have these issues of roaming and so on, it helps a lot to help our people in the border. We are also, as IACO, we have developed a digital inclusion strategies that, of course, comes from the best practices from the 6 countries that we are working on. So I think issues like this going to the future are going to be very important, so that we use all the possibility, all the energy, all the technology we have, all the options we have to make sure that we increase the access and the availability of networks to our kids. And I think I would also like to mention about the marginal groups, which are very key, and that we didn't take them very seriously, like children. During normal time, we never thought this is an issue. But when we were told that kids have to stay at home, they become marginal immediately. Now you have 2 kids, they have to access the school. It becomes a very huge issue. So we have to consider as going forward. And I believe that the government should take a big part. It has been a trend again, why the government is doing a very good job, most of our governments, but we are still looking at the ICT sector as a cash cow. And I think that is something we need to try to tell the government. They need to bring back a lot of money to the sector to cover most of the issues that we are discussing. That I think is also very important. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Ali. So we have people reacting now to the to my asking for questions in the Q&A. We have a question from Oscar, who is referring to Ghana, who apparently has a policy of reducing import tariffs by 50% and scrapping VAT on smartphones. And his question is whether this could be an answer to the problem of device costs, and are any of the East African countries adopting similar policies? Maybe that's a question for you, Ali.
Thank you, Danny. I think, as we discussed before, the issue of a multi-sector approach in these issues. And these are the issues that we've been raising, because you have the Minister of Finance that only think about getting a lot of money from this device. And we have one sector that is trying to convince people to raise the usability of ICT. So I think at the end, as a government should speak as one. You may lose a set amount by lowering VAT or some kind of taxes, but with the economy of scale of having many people using these devices, you can raise up the charges that they can help the government make profit out of this. So we have been having this challenge where one ministry is imposing a lot of taxes, and while other part of the government is trying to encourage people to use this device. So I think, again, we go back to where the government should be speak as one and should be multi-sector approach, rather than looking at it as a single ministry and something like that.
Thank you very much. We also have a question in the Q&A from Mike about the continued development of e-payment systems. And I think all of these questions are as we mentioned before, they show the importance of sharing good practices. We heard some of you speak to the benefits of developing services like e-payments in terms of reducing exposure to virus, and of course there is no limit on topics where we could benefit from from sharing experiences and developing as we go forward. We are growing very close to the end. As a moderator, I think it's part of my job to leave everyone to do whatever might be planned for after the 90 minutes that we had foreseen. I would like to ask everyone in the panel for a 30-second final word on what you hope for in 2021 in terms of measures that will really impact our ability to connect everyone and close the gap. So I'll start again, the same round as before. Annette, your 30 seconds starts now.
Well, I think that the world is not going to go back. We're moving forward, and COVID only threw a spanner in the works. We already had digital technologies impacting the way we live and work. And for me, I think trying to also explore the social and cultural implications of digital technologies in light of COVID, I think is a very important area that I hope that we can discuss in the future, because in that way, we will not leave anyone behind. And as a program that works for least developed countries, this is a cause that I care about.
Excellent, thank you very much. Brahim, what do you hope for the next year?
Well, I hope, first of all, the well-being and health for everyone in this call and everyone who's joining and listening and everywhere. So I think that's probably the most important, wish from my end. But definitely, I think I hope we continue on this momentum, what we've seen in the past year. And let's not mind some of the foundations that maybe we did not have time to talk about. Obviously, we talked about connectivity, we talked about digital skills, and so on. But I think we need to also think of the data protection, data privacy, the cybersecurity and resilience of the networks, because these, I think, will be a foundation for the future. And we've seen with the healthcare and when we had to think of solutions to prevent the propagation of the virus, there were so many issues in terms of can we track or not, people would, and that brings to the question of what type of data can you access or not. So I think this is a much bigger picture than just healthcare and COVID. The data protection, data flow, data privacy, responsible data sharing, ethics in terms of the future of using artificial intelligence and algorithms, all this I think should be, it's time, I guess, to learn from the past, but also to build a good foundation for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Brahim. And next, Irene, what are your New Year's wishes for this sector?
Personally, I keep remembering when I had a conversation with one of the operators, and they were like, why are you telling us to cover the national parks? So the animals going to use, the mobile phones. I think for me, COVID was one of those, if we needed a switch to say a eureka moment for all of us, I foresee that, we got that jolt, an electric jolt for all of us to start thinking afresh and having a new perspective in terms of, okay, what does it mean to say connecting everybody? And my hope is that it won't be so much about the competition, but more about harnessing those available resources so that there is less of duplication and more of harnessing available resources to achieve more gains.
Thank you very much, Irene. Kui.
Thanks, Dan. I think for 2021, my wish for us going forward would be to carry over some of the positive impacts we've seen from the pandemic, in that we've seen unprecedented collaboration between industries. Different industries have come together to actually achieve things that we never thought were possible before this pandemic. So I think that's a positive that I'd like to see us carry into the future. Another positive would be perhaps the creation of more meaningful relationships between business, government, and our communities, whereby we are actually developing and creating services that are more impactful and more meaningful for them, a social contract, if you will, so that they can create more access to essential services. And I think this will, it will influence policymaking for sure, by making sure that policies are more in tune with what countries need, like what Irene was alluding to in Hans as well.
Thank you so much, Kui. And the final New Year's wish from the panel goes to you, Ali.
Thank you, Danny. I think I may sound a bit over-optimistic, but I see this situation is temporary, that we are going back to normal. And as such, we should avoid to put into practice permanent solutions for this problem, because emergencies are going to come in the future. However, we should leverage the advantages that COVID has brought to us. So if it has helped us to come up with more, reducing the digital divides, that if it's come up to make sure that our citizens are served well, let's take that going forward. Also, we should not forget to keep reviewing our approaches as we did during the pandemic. And as important as I said before, is multi-sector approach that is going to take us to the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And my great thanks to everyone in the panel for sharing your experiences throughout the panel that we have had today. I hope and I really believe that all the participants who have been listening to us must absolutely have found something to take with them. I always go into these things hoping that I will have at least one or two new thoughts coming out of the session, and I certainly had this time. So thank you very much. And I think we have really heard that we continue to sharing ideas, to sharing experiences, and to work together to improve connectivity issues is really a common work between many different participations and interest group. Stakeholders are everywhere, and the complexity is not diminishing. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for being with us, and stay safe and healthy out there until we meet at some other platform soon. Thank you very much.